India and Japan join forces to counter China and build their own new Silk Road. As Xi Jinping seeks to exponentially expand China's economic and political footprint upon the Eurasian and African regions via his signature Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, a knee-jerk reaction can be observed from other Asian powers who are initiating and intensifying international development initiatives of their own. India and Japan are at the forefront of this movement, devising a mutual vision which could be labeled the other new Silk Road. Just days after Jinping's epic Belt and Road Forum in May, India's Prime Minister Modi unveiled a vision to counter the international ambitions of China at a meeting of the African Development Bank, AfDB, in Gujarat. Conceived during a meeting between Modi and Japan's Prime Minister Abe in November 2016 and cobbled together by a crew of think tanks comes something dubbed the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, AAGC. The AAGC is an initiative led by a partnership between India and Japan to better integrate the economies of South, Southeast, and East Asia with Oceania and Africa. The idea is to create a free and open Indo-Pacific region by rediscovering ancient sea routes and creating new sea corridors. In practice, it is conceptualized as being a series of enhanced, mostly sea-based economic triangles which will connect cities and other production hubs across regions that are predicted to rapidly rise and become the world's next epicenters of economic growth. Africa is without a doubt the next frontier of development, with the economies of a host of countries currently growing at rates between 7 and 10% per year. China has been incredibly active in this region, with trade growing at roughly 20% per year since 2000, amounting to $188 billion in 2015. One of the main goals of the AAGC is to balance out the influence and holdings of China in this rapidly emerging part of the world. In other words, so India and Japan can better claim their respective slices of the pie. The AAGC is a potentially powerful module that plugs nicely into India and Japan's other transcontinental interconnectivity and development endeavors. India, Russia, and Iran are busy at work putting together the North-South Transport Corridor, a multimodal route that goes from the west coast of India all the way to St. Petersburg, Russia. India also has its Connect Central Asia Policy, Act East initiative, an array of new road and rail projects that are extending throughout South and Southeast Asia, and seaport development projects at Chabahar in Iran and, potentially, at Para in Bangladesh and Trincomalee in Sri Lanka. While Japan has been at the Eurasian infrastructure development game for decades, building roads, rail lines, metro systems, and ports across the regions via financing vehicles like the Asian Development Bank, ADB, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, and, more recently, the Japan Infrastructure Initiative. Topping this off, is a recent promise from Prime Minister Abe to pump an additional $200 billion into emerging Asian and African markets, which seems as if it will more than likely be one of the sources of funding for the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. This partnership between India and Japan to develop enhanced economic networks throughout Asia and Africa as China's Belt and Road is very boisterously doing the same thing is showing signs of a geopolitical duality that is arising in Asia. When viewed from a certain angle, it appears as if two orders are emerging. On the one side is China, with its top-down processes and government-controlled economic institutions and enterprises, and on the other is a bloc being led by India and Japan, with their democracies and Western-style liberal economies. Japan and India are two countries that China historically has very terse relationships with, and an impending conflict always seems to be boiling just beneath the surface. Claims that China is developing Indian territory via portions of its China-Pakistan economic corridor led to a very public snubbing by India of Jinping's Belt and Road get-together in May. Hardly a month later, tensions with India flared up in the Doklam border region, as Indian and Chinese soldiers had some relatively low-intensity confrontations. While China's relationship with Japan is packed with some very deeply embedded adversity, which goes far beyond a mere political or economic rivalry. The United States is often oddly absent from these talks of Eurasian connectivity, and there is little physical evidence of their meddling on the ground. but it has to be wondered the degree to which the reigning and perhaps retracting global superpower is playing political blocks such as India and Japan to counterbalance the growing international clout of China. With cooperation and coordination, both India and China can make the 21st century a truly Asian century. Otherwise, conflicting Asian powers will offer opportunities for the West to continue its hegemony for some more decades, Gulshan Suchdev of Jawaharlal Nehru University recently stated in an op-ed in the Hindustan Times. This potential state of affairs that has reportedly not gone unnoticed by Beijing. The AAGC was duly derided in Beijing as a New Delhi-Tokyo scheme, aided and abetted by Washington, to sabotage China's drive towards Eurasian integration, Pepe Escobar claimed in the Asia Times. This dichotomy between political and economic systems seems to be getting played up in the initial round of promotions for the AAGC. While China's Belt and Road Initiative is government-driven, state bank-funded, and state company constructed to the point that some big and dynamic private Chinese companies were told in no uncertain terms to stop meddling abroad and go home, the AAGC is positioning itself as being a framework for investment in the emerging markets of Asia and Africa that is designed for the private sector. The AAGC has been spun by India as a project acceptable for the banking sector, as opposed to BRI's government-funded model, Escobar continued. If India's pan-Eurasian dreams amount to more than the musings of a prime minister, it would be interesting to see how these two competing models of connectivity building play out in the field. However, when viewed from another angle, it emerges that many of these seemingly oppositional initiatives line up and overlap on the ground. China's efforts to construct enhanced economic interconnectivity throughout Eurasia via the BRI will ultimately assist India's efforts to do the same, which will help Japan's infrastructure investments, which will help Russia's array of new dry ports, which will help Turkey's emerging transcontinental rail empire, which will help Iran's ambition of becoming a crossroads of Eurasia, etc. The building of roads and railways and power plants and new industrial zones and new cities are all vital pieces of the same puzzle of development in an expanse of the world that is rapidly on the rise. All of the pieces inevitably come together to produce something that no single country or bloc of nations could do alone. This is what is meant by competition on the new Silk Road.